Acknowledge that the press and public have been duly notified of the meeting in accordance with the Freedom of Information Act. We had previously scheduled to have Edisto Beach with us today, but due to the storm and them being a little bit further south, I felt it prudent to let them have a bye. So they'll be with us next week, hopefully, to discuss their Army Corps experiences. So we wanted to, since we had a meeting on the calendar and most were scheduled, wanted to just revisit our assumptions one more time as we try and nail down, around the financial piece of it. Mr. Trainum's with us online. Stephen, thank you for joining us as always. So we'll look at our funding assumptions, maybe get to the emergency policy. We also, last week when Folly was here, they brought up their dune management program. So I think you included a piece of that in the packet as well, if we have time to discuss that. Douglas, you want to take us through the assumptions, or just want to talk through them?
Yes. Yes. So what we're currently assuming is that the beach preservation fee fund will net about $700,000 annually. We have plugged in the frequency of large-scale projects to be every 8 years for 32 years, for a duration, total duration of 32 years. This next one is a one, I don't know that this group is really pinned down, but the cost share between the Wild Dunes Community Association and the city, we kind of continuously run two different scenarios. One is 75-25, with Wild Dunes paying 75%, the city paying 25%. That ratio is kind of closest to what has been the ratio for the last two major projects. We also run scenarios at 50-50, which that's kind of the wild card in our projections is what that cost share ends up being.
And these are for the Wild Dune specific projects, correct?
That's correct. So the way, the projects on the south end at Breach Inlet, we know that those will be 100% for the city. So these are just the north end.
And the north end is divided, if you remember the capital planning model, we have the cost of the Breach Inlet project, the cost of mobilization and demobilization separate, and the cost of the sand on the north end. And the idea was that if we do a project, we do both ends wherever it's needed at the same time, and you can minimize your cost of mobilization, which we know it's pretty high. So that assumption is 50-50 on the mobilization, which starts at about the $5 million cost, and that grows over time, obviously, with the cost of inflation, and 50-50 on the cost of placing sand on the north end. That's how that distribution works.
Next assumption is when we're running these projections, we are not including any state or federal grants. I think that historically we've ended up having some amount of state and federal money. And that's just, we could either include some amount, we could continue to kind of count on the worst case scenario and include no amount. So that's a little bit of a judgment call as to what to plug in there, but we have been plugging in no state or federal money.
Douglas, on that, could we, would it be okay if we got maybe 10 years of historical data so that we can have that in a notes section versus so that if someone was to ask, what have we typically gotten? We know it, yeah. And then we can easily average it if somebody wants to.
Kind of in a footnote, I will say, I think we can certainly do that. I will say that one of the two times that we did it, we had a pretty large federal portion that probably would skew because of storms. It was right on the heels of two storms, so we had a large federal share that it probably wouldn't be prudent to count on that
Correct.
amount. So that would maybe skew an average. So we could come up with kind of a.
And that's, I think, why it would be helpful to put in the notes, and you can then asterisk that. I think it's more for information, as people say, well, what has happened in the past? And that can be asterisked as this was due to a X, Y, and Z.
Storm.
And then instead of an average, we could do a median, or, like we can.
Yeah.
We have Scott, he knows math.
Because again, this is worst-case scenario model, to your point. And if somebody wants to dial back, we can dial back.
Yeah.
Once we get to council, if
Yeah,
there's
and I think it's a
different
very valid
conversations.
point. If we say nothing, and then somebody says, well, haven't we gotten something? They're gonna say, well, you're kind of painting this sky is falling scenario when it's really maybe not
Right,
ever been
and-
that dire, so it's a good point.
And I just want to be, because of the urgency of starting to move this through and the steps that need to go, I just want us to be fully prepared to answer any question and not have to say, we'll get back to you.
Right, yeah,
Too many times.
yeah. That's a good comment. Revenue growth, we assume 2% of revenue growth, and we expect expenses to grow at 3%. Project cost, we assume a 3% increase annually. So that has those out projects getting very expensive. We also are not putting into our assumptions any shoal management projects or any emergency work.
Correct.
So but I think some part of that is,
Are we assuming that comes out of the fund residual now? Because we put in about 1.8, 1.9. I think last year was 2.2, including interest, but we're netting only 700. Are those dollars in there somewhere, or do we need to account for them?
Yes, for FY '24 and FY '25, because we've had significant expense on the emergency piece, and we budgeted 400,000 for the beneficial
project.
use project, plus 25% of the shoal management that's built into the expenditure projection.
yes. So it kinda comes out of the seven-
Close to $1 million.
I'm sorry?
Unless I'm wrong. I thought we were generating close to $1 million a year instead of 700.
We generate roughly the last couple of years, we've generated about 2.25, because we've had really good tourism activity for, post-COVID. But there's a lot of expenses that come out of that account. There's constant monitoring, a lot of the emergency work, maintenance with the beach access pass. We add and maintain our boardwalks. All of that comes out of the beach preservation fund. Recently, we've been receiving grants for boardwalks, and we've been using grant money rather than funds on hand from the beach preservation fee fund.
Kind of what Cindy requested for the grant money. Maybe we should just take a look at a little bit of the historical on what the gross to the net has been, say, for the past 5 years on the beach renourishment fund, to ensure that we aren't, if we need to account for a shoal management project here and there, that we don't let it hang out there.
So that would be an asterisk at the 700,000. I mean, I think we're kind of saying we didn't want to put it in there twice. In
No,
other words, we
agreed.
didn't want
Right.
to say we're netting 700,000, but then also
Yeah.
Right.
account for shoal management projects, because it probably would be kind of double accounting for it.
Right, I think we're just validating that, in fact, yes, any shoal management project, the assumption would be any shoal management project is in the gross to net.
Yeah,
And,
that's how we've
yeah,
accounted for it.
Is
in
it
the
or
model.
isn't it? And if it is, great, and that would be fantastic, and if we can't cover it and we need to put an extra couple
So to
million in here and
Have to
there.
include it, yeah.
Explain that delta between the gross and the net, and just kind of
Yeah.
say, this is why, you'll hear that we
if
get a
we-
lot more in the fund, but
Right,
it's
if
only
we feel
net.
that with, between the gross and the net to this, and we're only assuming 700 towards the big nourishment
Yeah.
projects, that covers shoal management, that would be good news.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we
And-
think we need to add a couple million here and there along the 30, 25 years or whatever, then we can just plug that in.
For example, in FY '25, we're netting about 732, but '21, we don't have a project, so we netted 1.6. So
Yeah.
it just depends, and maybe looking at that history gives us a better sense of what's
You bet.
included. In those low years, it's basically because we're doing a shoal management project and we're counting on the beneficial use
And I guess
supplement.
with the shoal management, I mean, it's two things. It's an expense number, but is it also a hopefully push you out a year or two for doing a big project? Because so if we said we're going to hopefully have another shoal management project in 2030, instead of an 8-year cycle, could that take us to a 10? I mean, I know that's another
and-
assumption that we're making.
Yeah,
but-
that's
And I think Stephen can maybe speak to
Yeah.
this, but that's how we have historically allowed our projects on the north end, which is where we've only done them, to last 10 years, is doing two shoal management projects in between those 10 years. And that's why this permit application that we submitted for this shoal management project includes two borrow events, assuming that we need to do one in two, as soon as we get the permit, and then another one in 2 years before 2028, when the large project would come to fruition. So Stephen, if
Yeah.
Is that right?
That's, the option. I mean, it's always going to be a little uncertain with those. You have to look at how the shoals attach and the available amount of sand to be able to move. But that's the hope, is that those projects allow us to withstand some of these cyclic shoal-induced erosion problems. And if we, a year from now, we should be in an accretional cycle in that east end, but I can't tell you, of the hundreds of thousands of yards that are attaching, how much is going to the north, how much is going to the south. That's something that we just have to monitor and see. So, but the idea is, yes, these shoal projects help extend that window before you have to do a large-scale project.
And I think that that's going to be a decision point for the community and for council. When we get the shoal management permit, we do one in the winter. If the next time we have a hotspot, an erosional hotspot, if it's limited to, a smaller area within the beach, then council can decide we'll do another shoal management project because we would have that permitted, rather than doing a large-scale $20 million project. If you can push that back 2 years and do okay with the shoal. I think that that's just having those options, and that flexibility is what I think we recognize it's important.
Yeah, it's complex, no doubt, because I think we're as bad now as we've
Can you
ever-
give him a?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, there we go. I mean, it just seems like we're as bad now as we've ever really been, and we're still several years out from having a renourishment unless the council decides to do it sooner. So I think it's hard to, it almost seems like we have to expand it to address all of these different variables, because we're trying to figure out how do we prolong it to 10 years when we're not making it this time anywhere near that period of time. I mean, I really don't remember, and I've been here for a long time, the beach ever being as bad as it is right now, even when we did the renourishment projects historically. So I don't know how we can chart it out in a manner that makes sense, so that we can, I guess everything where we do the shoal management project, we're spending money on that with the expectation we're gonna pull it out another couple of years. But as Stephen says, we don't know if we're gonna make it another couple of years, and I still think the 8, but I think the more variables we have, I think we'll probably tweak this several times before we submit it and add some more information, because there's so many things that can happen along the way.
I will say though, Dan, and Stephen spent some time at the last presentation to council just showing the conditions of the beach today versus before we've done shoal management projects. And I think that we're in better, I'm not minimizing what we're going through today, but I think we've been in much worse shape. Is that correct, Stephen?
Stephen, the slide you showed, I think, was at council. Can you share that on your screen, just for this group, the kind of, to Dan's point about the condition now versus the condition before we did the last project? And I think generally, to summarize.
I need to pull that off my laptop, so it may take me a few minutes to get that. But generally, what that was saying is, if you take the cumulative area of that east end, it's got a lot more volume than it did in 2007 when we started our first round of kind of considering nourishment and doing the first project in 2008. So if you look from the area from basically Beach Club Villas all the way, even still including Ocean Club, there's a lot more sand in that area. There's a good bit more sand in front of the Grand Pavilion area right now, especially than we had in the 2016 period. So cumulatively, yes, we're in much better shape. So as we're doing these large-scale projects, we are building on each one over time. Now, we do have the severe localized erosion where you are as bad as you've ever been there at the Beachwood area. So it's both things are kind of true.
Last assumption on the page is to maintain a $2 million fund balance. That's kind of been a benchmark for us as we're running through these different scenarios of keeping at least $2 million in that account, not letting the account get below that amount.
We were just having some conversation around this. I mean, I'd like to, if it's possible, to see that number get a little higher, up to maybe 5 million. And I don't know if that's going to move the meter much, but with inflation, we're talking about a fixed number. And in 10 years, that 2 million becomes 1 million, becomes nothing over time. And I think for us to have these projects, in any kind, for us to have a little bit of an emergency reaction fund above 2 million, 2 million doesn't buy as much as we've seen. We spent roughly 3 million on the south end and the north end over the last year. We're still losing ground. So I wouldn't mind, if it's possible, to see a little bit bigger buffer in our.
And maybe that buffer, the target may be to have it 1 or 2 years before or after
not-
you do large projects. We're not going
It's
to need.
it's not an immediate, it's an over, we can't get there on day one, but
Correct.
maybe
Maybe it
after the first
grows,
project, yeah.
it grows kind of maybe at the same 3% that everything else in our schedule is growing might be a good.
Just see that target, maybe after the first renourishment, we start plowing towards a $5 million target instead of a $2 million target.
So I will say, from my kind of perspective, sitting in on these groups, and I don't know if this is going to be a decision for council or this group is a recommendation, but the annual additional revenue needed. I don't know that this group has set a number. I don't know if that would be a council role. I think that, from our perspective of running these different scenarios, there's, if we can generate $4 or $5 million annually, that kind of has a very rosy future. There's other numbers lesser than that we're kind of skating by, but getting by with these assumptions.
Wasn't it? It's sort of seeming like that with the model, tweaking that model, that 3 to 4 million annually, maybe something that would be great to get us through the first project, but we may not need that level of funding going forward. It sounds like that's tracking down a little bit towards a different number, which I don't want to just put out there.
So do we?
It might be better news than a 3 to 4 target.
Well,
over
and
the
it's,
long
again,
haul.
based on all of these
Exactly.
assumptions. If
Assumptions
our
can change,
revenues
yeah.
continue to grow at a certain rate,
exactly.
if that changes, then that changes the entire outlook.
Yeah,
So do you all feel like that's a council?
I do.
Yeah.
Okay, so this
I mean,
group
I think
has
we're-
identified the
We're serving
triggers.
up all these assumptions with the models that have been built, with all the footnotes, because there's a lot of footnotes
Yeah.
and assumptions on this thing. And then the need is whatever it is, somewhere between 1 and 4 million a year, based
And like
on a whole
council
lot of assumptions, and that's
drill
the
that
council.
down.
I think
Okay.
so.
So
I mean,
for this
we-
group,
Again, so this group, we just took it to council last week.
Tuesday, this
right,
Tuesday.
Of what came out of this group as suggestions for additional revenue. So I think that torches have been passed.
What I think we need
Yeah.
maybe to talk, is I think at one of the meetings, Dan had suggested to look at being even more aggressive than 8 years in the frequency of these large projects, the 6 years. And we did run that, and financially, it's very, very hard.
And I figured it would be. One of the hard parts, though, is kind of the battle of deciding, and do we renourish the beach when we need the renourishment, or do we renourish it when we think we can afford to renourish it? A lot of things in life, it would be a great thing in life if we could always do what we wanted to do when it was the right time and we can afford to do it. Sometimes we don't have that liberty, and we have to do it when it needs to be done. And I thought it was important to look at it, because if we follow the track and decide we're gonna do it when we can afford to do it versus when we need to do it, then we're gonna have some issues along the way. If we look at it from the standpoint of we're gonna do it when we need to do it, not when we can afford to do it, then it's a revenue nightmare. But at the end of the day, from my perspective, the entire island and the whole ecosystem and all the ATAX and all the revenues that we bring in and everything that supports the police to the firemen to the buildings to everybody here, and our home values is predicated on a healthy beach. So I think that to ignore that and to only look at it from the perspective of when we can afford to do it might be a problem, but it does create a different issue of how do we raise even more monies than we're talking about. And I'm not suggesting that we should, I'm hoping that the Band-Aids and doing things along the way prevent it, but at least so we would have that knowledge. We know what 10 years looks like, because we've done it for 10 years, and we know that historically that's pushing the envelope pretty good, especially lately. 8 is a goal, and I'm not saying it's not a realistic goal, but I think if the goal is for us in a meeting in a group that's going to study these things to present it to council, we should look at it, because once council gets it, the problem they have is they're facing a number without all the back information, other than, you guys that are here, obviously. But that's why I was suggesting it.
So, oh, go ahead, Scott.
No, I was going to say, just to quote Nicole Elko last week, I think she had a profound opening statement, something about the economy goes by the way of the beach. And we're all kind of tied to that, so we got to do whatever we can to keep it healthy.
Keep it.
So all that I was going to, totally in the same vein, Dan, is I think that whatever we present needs to come with, whether it's a written report or otherwise, with the caveat that this is the best estimate, and that's all that it is. And because it's a best estimate and we're in changing times on a barrier island, that we need as a community to continue to work aggressively to find other sources such as those that, we put into the bottom, those that would take more time. Because with the knowledge that sometimes need has to override the bank account. So I think it can't be stagnant in the sense we can't say that this is the model, this is the funding. I think we're going to need to still be lobbying and to fill that coffer a little bit fuller, and then it could be evaluated as the need comes. But we got to pick a number or it's going to stay in committee.
I'd like to jump in for just a second on that. I think, critically, it's important to have your permits in hand to allow you to have that flexibility. So I think the model we've been talking about is having a permit ready to go in year 5 or 6. So even if we have storms or higher erosion, you have the ability, and then you basically, if your funding's on an 8-year plan, you've got a 2-year gap to make up. And at that point, you may have to go to the wild dunes owners to say, hey, if you want a project now, you got to increase your share. We could potentially reduce the scope of, the amount of sand to meet the budget. There's a lot of flexibility you kind of have in that. So, but having that kind of permit ready to go is I think, critical part of it.
And that's a good update for this group. We may have not discussed this, but City Council approved the second phase for the design and permitting of the large-scale projects with the goal of submitting that and getting it by the end of 2025, which would allow us, based on our models, we're looking at 2026 or 2027 at a time that we may need to trigger that. But that would be the goal. So we've accelerated that permitting, design and permitting process to get us to having a permit on hand, maybe a few years before we may even have to use it, but would have the option.
That's great news. Thank you.
So in terms of the funding piece, or we would update these assumptions, provide that. I think I'm hearing that this group is kind of finalizing and and I guess it's not really a recommendation as much as it is, here are the assumptions, here are the list of levers that you have. Council, it's your job to figure out exactly the annual additional income you need to make this happen. Here are the levers to do that, and let council wrangle through. Is that kind of
I
where
think
we
so.
think we are?
But I'm gonna come back to something Scott said too, because this net revenue number is pretty critical, obviously. So in thinking about the shoal management and the emergency work, so this year, I don't know how to get this in future model years, but there are going to be some years where we don't have emergency work. There'll be a number of years where we don't have shoal management work. that we
Permit
might
work.
net.
Or permits or
Yeah,
any?
we're always going to have Stephen, the monitoring, the beach access pass. So some number's going to be where there's 700,000 or a million, whatever. And I guess what I'm getting to is some years we're going to have no emergency work and shoal management, vice versa comment, I mean, we're going to net more or less than this 700,000, I guess is where I'm getting to.
And I
I
think
know we
the-
haven't talked emergency work yet.
Yeah,
for
I think the
future.
way to show it in the model is, let's get an understanding of just regular ongoing expenses associated with permitting, monitoring.
Outside of this special
Outside,
work.
and then maybe the shoal management, we include under another line, capital outlay. In those years, we include the cost of those projects separately, so that we can see exactly what a normal year.
Yeah, so kind of to Scott's point, it's
Mm-hmm.
not buried in the net, not buried, I don't mean that, it's just not out of the net, it's a specific line item that we can see.
I think you
Correct.
just
Yeah, I think
described
that's-
recurring and non-recurring.
Correct.
Yeah,
exactly.
I think that's the path.
And I'll say to kind of an overarching part of this that's throughout all of these assumptions is we really don't know if the breach inlet end, we've had these last 2 or 3 years that have been really bad.
Yeah,
Prior to that, it was accretional, not bad. So we don't know if we build our models assuming that last 2 years is the new normal. And we kind of are. I mean, that's kind of what we're building
Yeah.
everything
Worst case,
based on,
yeah.
is that is the new normal. And we just don't know, we will not know. So that's also going to drive those nets where the last 2 years have been really hard on the city's funding because it's been such a bad 2 years. If we look back 5 years, it'll show very rosy
Yeah.
kind of outlook. So that's just we're trying to figure out, is this the way it is going forward, or is it more like what it was 5-6 years ago? And that's a wild card
Yeah,
throughout all
gotcha.
of this.
So just the only comment I'd have is, going back for a second, on the 700, maybe we average it out over the 8 years, and we show what the numbers are, so we're not basing on 700. And as far as the new norm, you're 100% correct. Could get worse, hopefully it gets better, but I think this is a pretty good guesstimate, and ideally, next year, council's sitting there saying we can revisit this because we're in 5 years, everything's gotten a whole lot better, and we're not spending what we've been spending.
Yeah.
And then the other part is we always got to calculate back in, if we weren't spending that money, not only are we saving the money, but also that money would go towards any renourishments. So it's the constant, like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? How do we spend it?
I hope we
So-
do have that problem, Dan, that it gets better, that we have excess funds.
Stephen, and I think Amy may have done it, put your last, I don't know if you can see it through your camera, but that's the
Yeah.
2007 versus today photographs on the north end. Can you walk through
Yeah,
that?
that's what. So just kind of looking at the top photo on the right, so it's the Summer Dunes Lane area. Bottom photo is the Seascape Protocol area towards the east side, which, again, in 2007, that was the critical area that kind of drove the initial project. So, again, not to suggest at all that everything's rosy out there, but cumulatively is the word I can never say. We're still a lot better off than we were in that condition from 53rd Avenue north.
Thank you.
And then, Stephen, it's worse, though, as you go further south, correct? When you get to the Beechwood area, because
Yeah, the Beechwood area was in better shape in 2007 and 8. In 2016, at the worst stages of the erosion cycle before the last project, it was close to where it's at, not quite, but that pool that's there at the Beechwood was fully exposed. There was a couple of feet of sand, but there were sandbags kind of holding the line behind the wave dissipation device in 2016. So it was close, but not quite as bad as it is today for several of those properties.
when I walked it last, and it's been probably 2 weeks, I went to property owners and walked towards Beechwood, and you're starting to see it adding up pretty good at property owners, and it's starting to head towards Shipwatch also, I've noticed. So it does seem to be expanding. Do you agree with that it's starting to expand and get worse?
I think the erosional arc is shifting towards the south. We're actually seeing some accumulation. This was early last week. We were seeing some accumulation towards the Dune Crest area. That the wooden seawall that kind of sticks out at Beechwood, that's a good gauge of where the sand is. And it had been much more exposed, and the beach there has probably gained 3 feet to 4 feet in elevation over the past couple of weeks. But as you go down towards the south end of Beechwood, working towards the revetment, the Armstrong revetment, that area does seem to be getting worse. And I think it's extended that gap that's between the shoal that's offshore and the shoal that's attached to Green Pavilion is shifting to the south, and that erosion mark is shifting with it.
And Stephen, you mentioned at some meeting earlier that we're starting to see at Ocean Club some signs of significant erosion at that kind of very northern end as well, correct?
Right. We knew that the way the shoal is is starting to attach, the next 12 months or so is kind of a likely erosional cycle for the north end. So we're expecting we'll see some more erosion before we start to see that sand really spreading from the shoal. And that's why we included that as a potential build site for the shoal management project.
Yeah, so that shoal management project on that end is pretty desperately needed now.
Can we talk about the emergency erosion protection?
Next item.
Is that it?
That's next.
Because I think it's important to, set up at least an understanding or a policy, and a recommendation from this committee, I think would be helpful. If the city is going to be responsible for always having a permit on hand, which, permits cost almost $1 million at the end of the day, between the design, engineering, and all that. And
For the big project.
for the big projects, correct, for the large-scale offshore dredging projects. And we're accelerating how often these are done. Should the city consider in its projections for future expenditures that in emergency situations, $2 to $3 million is expected within a year to get us through another project? I know that we've talked about doing projects more frequently may mitigate emergency conditions, but we can't there's no guarantee. We know Dare County, who is a model of being a proactive community and having projects every 5 years, they still have houses falling into the ocean 2 years after a project. So while it would be, it's a great goal that we don't have those situations, we know that can change pretty quickly and pretty dramatically. Is the expectation that the city is still going to be the solely responsible for those? Or with a commitment of the city to doing large-scale projects, when those situations arise, that is going to be the responsibility of the property owner. There's definitely value in pros and cons of both approaches. But I feel like that's something that we haven't really discussed at length with this committee, and maybe get to a recommendation or just some thoughts.
One of the comments I'd make is that, it's hard to define when the situation arises, because when the city passed the tax in order to generate the money, the issue was to protect the beaches and to protect the beach accesses. And it wasn't really defined as, if you got 10 homes in dire straits, is it not enough to do the repairs, so we'll let them fall in? Do we need to have 20 or 30 or 40? How many homes do we have to have in order to make a decision to make the repair? And I think that's one of the complications here. But certainly I think we all can recognize that once the beach renourishment's done, you're not going to have $3 million a year every year, because you're going to have years and years and years of wonderful beach, and where that's not going to be a problem. Maybe you get 5 years. I think this last time we had 5 years without any problems. So we had 5 years with no expense at all. And then the expense is going to be for the next period. So maybe it's going to be 3 years if we do it every 8 years. So it's not a $3 million per year. Maybe it's going to be $3 million for 3 years. And then part of, I think, what we had talked with Stephen about was, and the committee's discussed, is how do we react in a manner that, I'm just throwing it out there, how do we act in a manner which helps to enhance the beach we have and be more proactive, so that we can limit the expenditures. So for example, with the shoal management projects, if we had done it sooner, for example, we would have saved the significant amount of money we spent this year, although we would have output money somewhere else.
But that's the point, Dan. We couldn't have done the shore management project sooner because it was not accessible. We have to
still
wait,
can't do it.
we have to wait. We can't do it today,
Still
even
not
if we had
close
the
enough to
permit.
do it.
Right.
Well, but there's other avenues we could do to bring in sand, and there's other things we can do.
But
would-
so that's,
That's the
would-
question.
that's the question.
But it
Right
comes back to
now,
the same comment I made before, I think 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, which was that I don't know if council has the right to reinterpret or to, I'm sure they have a lot of rights, don't get me wrong, but how do we pass a tax for a set purpose that becomes a law, basically? And then decide we're gonna define now, years into it, what it means. Because that's not, when the referendum went up, we look at the referendum, it was very clear what it was for. And now we're gonna say, we're gonna change it.
well, I mean,
based on
it's the same
council decision.
argument every other community that has the ability to raise the beach preservation fee fund or tourism taxes, which are eligible to be used for beach preservation, and they do not pay for any emergency protective work. That's the responsibility of the owner.
Guess
So-
it depends on how it's written, though.
It's the same, it's state law. It applies to everybody.
Just so I'm clear, I think what you're asking for, and I agree, this is what you're talking about, is that, I don't see in the city codes or anything where beyond our long-range comprehensive plan, which I think we ought to bring a copy of that to, or at least that section to the next meeting. We have a stated policy that was, we have to submit through state and required every few years to update. There's a stated policy on the city's position, and I think it does talk about preserving and protecting the dunes and the beach. That's a policy that's been written, but it's such a high level. You start breaking that down to individual events and occurrences, it's not always clear what the city's going to do and what the residents are responsible to do. And if we want to get to a point, say like where Folly Beach is, where they have very clear delineation between what the residents can do to protect their homes and what the city's requirements are to augment that and get it ready for a renourishment project, we're going to need to have that pretty well documented. And then if we're going to say, hey, you know what, residents, we're going to do a cost share on this next situation, we need to be able to have policies in place that enable them to do that, to protect their own property. I think a lot of residents are willing to spend money to protect their own property, but it's, if you cascade from our comprehensive plan down to our, we've still got that 50-year policy in place about the 250-foot restrictions to, I think right now we're kind of ad hocing when the city engages and when the city doesn't and how we spend our money. And we're trying to help residents out, and some residents are bringing in sand, but there's no clear, consistent policies. And I think you're asking, I would love to have that, so then we can give it to the residents and say, you know what, you're on your own for this, but the city's gonna kick in for that.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, if the residents are gonna protect their homes this way, this is how you can do it, and here's how you can't do it. And if they're left high and dry because they can't either put in a wall or bring in sand or bring in sandbags because of where they are in the erosion process, we just need to make that very clear.
I think that's
Yeah,
the goal.
That's
Yeah.
the goal.
And
An aspiration.
And I think that when Nicole spoke last week, one thing that resonated with me was that it was it seemed to underline the policies that were created, and no policy is going to be perfect or implemented. I think we all recognize we're all doing, the goal is to everyone do their best. Is that the underlying goals seem to be to have a healthy beach and to protect the homeowners. And she also spoke about realities. The reality is sometimes the best efforts can't move forward the way we want them to, so we have safeguards. And that's those sorts of conversations where we're working together, the homeowner and the community, I think are just really important. And it was very refreshing to hear that. And I think as we move forward to have that underlying, our thought process would be healthy. But no, and I 100% agree, we have to find that, and we're struggling. We're struggling because city council approved sandbags, but then there was a sandbag issue. So I was approved for sandbags in June, and I still don't have sandbags because there aren't sandbags, you know.
Yeah, that gets
So-
execution. Yeah.
Right, so there are just various things that come up. So yes, there needs to be communication and policies that help with that delineation.
Well, should we spend a meeting dedicated to kind of going through and trying to delineate that? I mean, we've got a lot of questions here that are great,
They're
but
great
if we have
questions.
if we could start the meeting maybe with, how is Folly doing it? They were gonna give us that information. And then also looking at our, comprehensive plan language to say, hey, is this still valid? Or do we need to maybe revisit this or clarify it so that we're all on the same page? And that's a policy issue. And then we've got the preparation. These questions are great questions, and they all need to be answered, and I think they're answerable. It's just how do we give, we've got to give you all some pretty good guidelines and guardrails as to what we're going to do and when we're going to do it.
Yeah, it's, the packet includes a copy of the ordinance from Foley, so that may be something
Yeah,
that
my
you all could,
mistake.
it's a lot to digest, so maybe between now and our next meeting,
But
we,
it's very clear, duties of the property owners, notice of property owners, yeah.
maybe we can use that as a base. And, they did establish another line. Very different circumstances, from Foley to here, but we can use some of their models to establish, a line, or we can use an existing line that determines, what's gonna be could determine what the responsibility of the owner, and giving them those guidelines and the support and the policy to allow them to do what they can within that area. But maybe that could be a starting point, just what's worked. This is recent. We all know, you heard, they implemented this in 2018. So I think it's a good start to at least help us create a policy.
Then I guess I agree, and I think we have to also consider the circumstances that probably are different. Because they're allowing walls, for example, that are
That's right.
working.
That's right.
And they're happy with them, and so when they're telling the property owners you're on your own to some extent, they're also allowing them to build walls to have protection. If you can't get bags and you can't build walls, and it's a little different situation, and we certainly want to avoid any kind of argument of a taking by limitation.
I've heard, people on the front beach talk about there's confusion on the baseline and the setback, and there's that gray area that no one's really taking responsibility for. Is that been cleared up? Have they established the baseline and the setback? I know they're supposed to do that.
I don't think there's
Coming up soon.
confusion on the baseline or the setback line. Those are lines drawn stagnant for 7 years at a time. But I think the confusion is their jurisdictional lines. So as the ocean comes and goes, I think that's the point of confusion, as I understand it from property owners, that when the beach comes landward of their setback line, did the state truly take jurisdiction, which is their position, or did they not? So I think that issue, I don't think the state feels there's any gray area, but I think that property owners believe that there's gray area in that.
Okay.
Cindy, you're close to that issue. Anything to add to that?
No, I mean, basically, it's the critical line invading it past the setback line. So landward of the setback line is where the issue is as regards jurisdiction. And yes, I did spend a fair amount of time on that issue and up in Columbia arguing it. And I got and the previous DHEC board was very supportive of property rights and building a wall, because I think they recognize the issues that islands like we were facing. Unfortunately, that DHEC, things are different, and we're, as far as that DHEC board is no longer that DHEC board, but I don't think that changes. So there's just a lot going. I don't want to do a whole discussion here, but they were not opposed to some of the things that we have not moved forward with on this island yet. But I think this is really helpful to see this and to have these discussions sooner than later, because we're clearly facing a number of property oceanfront owners. We are paying for some of our for sand right now, which And some of the other things that are available as you look at this, like sandbags, are just the economy of scale of a homeowner hiring someone to buy, to get the sandbags, to then hire someone else to fill the sandbags, then hiring someone else to implement. That seems to be more of a economy of scale, and perhaps those are things we look at too, with what is best and can be done by a homeowner and what can't. And I think that now is also a good time to look at the beach as you see what's happened as various things have been done, sandbags and how they have or haven't worked, sand being brought in by owners and how that has and hasn't worked, because you have properties that have sand that has been brought in by a private owner next to homes that haven't brought it in, see if it's been effective, look at how the wall that is there has worked or hasn't worked, what the property that doesn't have a wall. I think that's really illustrative if you look at the house that doesn't have a wall next to the house that does have a wall. It is which is you as a property owner or a beachgoer would prefer. I mean, I have my opinions, but I think this is a really good time to see and then
It's
come
like a
back to
case
this
study.
meeting. So I invite everybody to get out to the beach and then come to this meeting with a really good attitude, because I'll bring one, I promise. You know, I'm willing to listen. Just like with when I was talking about the asterisks earlier, a lot of my asterisks are one to answer the question for council because they haven't had the benefit, but they're also, we are 10, 12 people. They may have a really great idea too, but they, in order to see that, they need to see what we've already scoured through. And hopefully if they can, if, you know, city council can solve the problem we haven't been able to on funding completely, I go for it, guys.
Well, I wanted to
We
add
all
one
want the same
thing- I
thing.
wanted to add one thing on there. It's interesting because I went out and looked at the wall, and aesthetically, all I heard was it's going to be a big wall over there as opposed to all the beautiful dunes and the other homes. And maybe that's the way it was when it started, but now what I see is it's a wall which is secured, and then I see crumbling properties and plastic fences and a lot of disarray. And from a tourist standpoint, who's coming out there and seeing a battered beach, it's not good. And we all know the old saying, you know, it takes a long time to build up your reputation, but you can lose it very quickly. And we certainly do rely on all the tourism and people coming out here and that revenue. So it does concern me. If anybody hasn't gone, or if anybody listening to this hasn't gone, I would invite them to go out there and take a look, because I think what they'll see is going to be different than their impression may be before they go out there.
This is the time to
And
see
Douglas,
the
is
differences.
this is it from Folly?
No, I will say that that is
piece.
a piece to the kind of discussion here. I mean, there's also policy on allowing the walls. It's
Yeah.
not in what was, so I think what I was hearing from the group, we'll start this discussion, we'll start with kind of the germane pieces out of the beach management plan, kind of maybe start there. We can give a more complete copy of the Folly Beach ordinance, or we could, might be good, and because there's there's a lot of, we may try to kind of create a matrix of what they allow, kind of what their triggers are versus, I don't know if there's a way to kind of compare what they allow versus us, and have just they allow walls, but they don't do any emergency work. We don't allow walls. We're currently doing emergency. So we can probably kind of create a comparison chart for the group to kind of be able to look quickly and decipher what the differences are, and kind of give a snapshot of our current condition of policy versus theirs, and just compare the two to see if,
So
Their
that, just,
comprehensive plan is pretty good. I looked at last week,
so Bali's in a,
but they have a different situation.
yep,
Yeah.
Bali's in a completely different situation than us when it comes to walls.
yes, very much so.
We, the one wall that we have is not allowed by the state, correct?
Correct.
Don't
So-
we have more walls than just that
Well,
one?
the one that's,
I mean, we have more
very
walls, that's all I
exposed.
want
Yeah,
to point
walls
out.
were exposed.
yes, we have walls that were put in
Prior to the act.
before.
Prior, yeah.
Correct.
But, I mean, I think it's a little bit unfair to compare us to Folly in that situation, because even if the city completely got out of this, we would not be allowed to put in the walls like Folly Beach. I mean, and the reason that they're allowed is because they're on the south end of the jetties.
Jetty.
I mean, that's,
So we couldn't allow it where the one that was built on the south end was built, but we could allow them up by the house, which is pretty close to what Folly Beach does. If you look at Google Earth and see their revetments, you have a house just outside of the back of the house. There's riprap or there's a wall. And the city could allow that if there was a willingness to do it on the south end. Can't do it in the Wild Dunes end because the entire neighborhoods are in OCRM's jurisdiction, which would not allow it.
Let me ask, and maybe this is a legal question, but can the city, and I'm not suggesting we do anything yet, but can't we allow whatever we want to allow within the private property up to the baseline and the setback line? If
Yeah.
it's private
Yes.
property?
up to OCRMs.
Up to
Up to
OCRM's
the state.
jurisdiction.
The problem
we can-
is, on the north end, there is nothing, because there's, 3 houses
All
that are
setbacks
seaward?
behind that, yeah.
And then on the south end,
I'm thinking of the
most
entire
of the,
island.
most of the pools were built landward of the maximum build line, which they're right up, basically up against, or are some of them behind the
Some of
OCRM
the
line?
pools, none of them were built seaward of the OCRM line.
But where it is now.
To Tim's point, OCRM's jurisdictional line came landward, and some of those pools would have come into an area where a pool was.
Yeah.
And that's the, sort of the argument of the several emergency ordinances that council considered, is to allow some type of revetment as landward as possible, which I think was 20 feet.
Right.
It was 20 feet out, not 20 feet back, yeah.
20
It was
feet
a
from the,
suggestion.
20 feet from the structure.
Yep.
Not including pools, I think was the last version that was considered.
So, I'm sorry.
No, no,
So I guess one of the questions is whether or not if OCRM would approve it, would the island oppose it?
So historically not. I mean, historically, but historically OCRM won't approve it. But there are situations, we had the wave dissipation device in the northern end. State approved it. City didn't have any objection to it.
But are you saying landward of the setback line, OCRM doesn't have jurisdiction? it's the city
Seaward, I think,
jurisdiction, yeah.
but his question was if OCRM allowed it,
Yeah.
which they would only have an opinion seaward of their jurisdiction. They have kind of no opinion when it's landward of their jurisdiction.
So that's and again, and I want to, we have a lot bigger, other issues, and I'm going to have to go in just a second, but I would bring up on that question, which is good, Dan. For example, on the south end, you have 2 at least. So you have 2 houses right now where their structure is within feet. There's nothing left. Okay, so they're not what you have out on your end of the island. It's not under the house, but it's there. Like escarpment is there at the edge of their house. OCRM might, I don't know, say they have critical that to me would be one where you go to OCRM and say, I have a house sitting here. Can I put something to protect? Because it's their wall. It's their back door. It's not anything that's involving any of the issues. So that might be a time where that would be a question for OCRM, would be in the event we have these, they would have to bring it, I think, but these 2 homes, would you, again, and I'm making an assumption, I don't know they're past their critical, but that would be a viable, because the next step is there isn't much between them and.
But Cindy, are you saying you believe that area between the escarpment and the home
There is
is
no-
outside of their jurisdiction?
Well, I don't know. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying that would be an example where if OCRM said that your home is now passed into the critical area, you would go to them and say, can we do this, ask for an exception, because we're now trying to actually protect our back
home.
door. I mean, they're literally, this is the back door and this is the escarpment.
And-
There
and I-
is no yard left.
And I'm not trying to beat a dead horse, but I keep thinking about the fact that the state right now doesn't want to give funds. But at the same time, they want to regulate. And it seems like, I just have a hard time not going back and saying, guys, do one or the other. Like, you can't completely close this out.
Oddly, it used to be the same jurisdiction doing both. It used to be OCRM used to hand out the money and the regulations. They finally got to a point where it was the PRT was going to be the funding mechanism and OCRM was going to be the regulatory. But it was even funkier when it was, they would hand money on one hand out of the same department.
So Douglas, I wonder, and Desiree, if we can prep Edisto for next week to tell us where they are with the Army Corps, and at the same time, kind of what we're looking at with Folly.
Oh,
What are
have
your
a
emergency
erosion
measures?
control.
Yeah, what are your erosion control? Maybe they can
Okay.
speak to that.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
While we've got them.
While we have them.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So we've got Edisto next week. Just looking at calendars and kind of.
And we'll spend the majority of next week on emergency response
Well,
policy.
Next week, you're going to spend with Edisto, right? I mean,
Okay,
that's
you
gonna
want to,
take-
so you
So
want
good. That gives you 2
to,
weeks.
okay.
Yeah, I think that, I mean,
Okay.
if Folly took the whole time.
Does it make
Yeah.
sense at some point to invite, and I don't know if they come, but to invite the homeowners on the beach on the south end, the front beach owners, to come here? I know they could do it on Zoom, but maybe coming and actually, not to speak, but just to tell them we've got Nicole coming, or we got somebody coming to talk about the impact of the Army Corps, just so they can hear it and be focused on it. Because if at the end of the day, one of the issues with the Army Corps is that you have to have unanimous vote by everybody to give up their rights. Maybe if they came here and saw it, it would be more impactful for them to make the decision whether they agreed or didn't agree. Just thinking ahead a little bit.
Yeah. So go ahead, Douglas, you.
I mean, they're welcome to
They
attend
come to
and
anything,
hear.
yeah.
But unless they're paying attention to the meeting, it's like everybody else, they hear, headlines
Yeah.
or snapshots, and they don't really know what happens.
Was that a separate, I don't know if you want to use it. Is that a separate meeting, at the rec center or something, where you
Yeah.
invite, you publicize it, you talk about what the topic is, and hey, if we're gonna pursue this with the Army Corps, we need to.
Here's what it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah,
That-
here's what it is, and are you in or you're out, and if you're out, why? Maybe we can address it. That's sort of a separate whole.
There's
It
definitely a
is,
chicken and an
and it-
egg
and it-
conundrum of spending all of this resources, effort to get it there, and then go and say, hey, we've spent millions of dollars, we're
The application
eligible.
fee, yeah, you don't want to do that.
Are you going to be willing to do this?
We need to
But-
do that before.
And
Yeah,
that was
right.
the biggest issue this go round,
And
with
the-
just,
and the millions of dollars actually is essentially we're gonna have a shortfall of millions of dollars. I'd hate to spend it. I'd rather have it and use it somewhere else.
Right.
And at least get a sense from them. I know nobody's gonna commit to anything until it's done, but at least get a sense if there's a willingness to do it.
Well, and the reverse of that is the city is willing to fund this application if you. are willing
That's
to
what
sign on
I
to
I
this.
think we have to do it that way.
Yeah,
I think
I'm
it's
with you.
absurd to spend
To go down the
uh,
path.
Yep.
$3 million and have one person not sign it.
well, and these are,
Katie, you
these are
saying, get a
perpetual.
written, trying to get a written kind
Yeah.
of commitment prior to even,
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's responsible to do this because maybe I'm way too pessimistic, but I don't think that we're going to get everyone to sign it. I mean, I just don't. And so
I think you're right.
Well,
so
and
not
the
the
city-
easement, but a commitment?
The city
No,
has an easement currently from those properties, but there was overwhelming pushback about the idea of a perpetual easement. And the
Right.
city reached a compromise to accept a two-year easement because we knew we needed to get something done. We knew we needed it for the supplement work from the Corps.
But this is
But the
different though.
Corps would require perpetual easement, and we're not drafting that agreement. There's very little
Yeah, we don't have leeway.
amendments.
I
They have
agree,
a standard.
But
Yeah.
the easement earlier was different, because now you're talking about if someone's gonna come in and perpetually take care of the beach and create this plan, it's a different presentation, because they can rely on this, it's a permanent type deal. So I understand what you're saying, I've heard all about the issues with that before, but I think this is different.
That was, the general kickback was, you want a permanent easement, but you're only really telling us you're gonna be working on the beach for the next few years.
Right, right.
So, I mean, I do think but I'll also say, we weren't successful, we still haven't been successful in getting 100% of two-year easements for
That's,
erosion actively happening at its worst in that area, and we still haven't gotten.
And I would say from my perspective, going through that very traumatic process, a lot of it was not necessarily who is going to be responsible for how long. It was, I think, a general misunderstanding of what the easement does and what rights you're giving up by signing a perpetual easement. And I know that is, I've talked to my counterparts in Edisto and Polly's. That's the underlying challenge, just people's interpretations of what it means. And regardless of the state saying, you're not giving up your rights, you're just giving, people have their own beliefs, and getting through that was the very
But
much
we've
challenging
got
part.
time on that. I mean, that's
But I
that's
think
out
we're all in
there.
agreement that we ought to get the commitment or the easement in place before we file the application.
So you think actually try to actually get the easement before we've heard whether or not we would
I don't know if
be.
you can do that
Yeah. No,
it's
legally,
a-
but
yeah.
I think we need,
It's a multi-step.
I think we need something. I mean,
Kind of a commitment if, and maybe
If
it's
it
an
gets
automatic,
Contingent.
an easement contingent upon approval. If it becomes a federal project, this document automatically becomes a permanent easement.
It'd be interesting to hear from Edisto, other communities that have gone through the process. That may not even be feasible. I don't know, because I would think that other communities would want to
Do the same.
do the same
Yeah.
before going down the path. So that's a good question.
We're always cutting edge.
I know.
I mean, maybe we just,
A couple of thoughts on that. I fully agree. And it sounds like overkill and premature, but trying to get that easement issue resolved ahead of time is by far in your best interest. The issue that you'll run into is the Corps bases their easement off of their design. So they come up with where the landward extent of their nourishment fill would be. And I don't really like the way they do that, because they basically design a project off of a condition that they assume, and then anything seaward of that. But if the beach erodes due to a storm beyond that line further landward, then they actually don't have an easement over that area, and Follies run into that and some issues. My engineering recommendation is you want that easement line as close to the structure as possible. And if I'm a property owner, that's what I want, because if my beach is gone, I want somebody to come back and put that dune back. But owners don't seem to like that. They want that easement as far away from their house as possible, because they feel like they're giving up, their property. So if you're trying to do something preemptive of the core study, you're gonna have to decide, where that line would be, at least as an example, which is probably, landward of where the dune line looks like it is today. You could use where the dune line is today, you're just in jeopardy of excluding some potential fill area should the beach erode in the future. And I know that I went back and forth with the Corps a little bit along Edisto about where that line should be. And it was a hard sell to try to convince the owners and even the Corps to move it as far landward as you can, because of the issue of getting an easement. So.
Seems like there's a hang up on the use language in the easement, and to Desiree's point, their staff will tell you, we're only going to use this for construction. But I think residents read the language and think this is perpetual, and it has language in there about, the limitation of use of the property. And I think I hear that that's what gets folks bundled up. I've also heard rumor that they may try to change that, loosen that use language, but.
The Army Corps.
Army Corps.
I mean,
Steve, are you aware?
maybe the place to start is to talk to the two people that have refused to sign the one right now. And
We do know the hard nuts to crack in that stretch. We know them.
I mean, and if
Start
there's,
there.
I mean, I hate to, they one person can hold this whole entire
You're exactly right.
project
That's-
hostage.
And just information right now, I think if they know, right now what they know is that as days go by, the beach is not getting better, to a large extent. It is some, but maybe around the wall. It's generally not getting better, so they see what's gonna happen. the idea that their home would be perpetually protected with this plan that somebody else is paying for, that council doesn't shift or have the ability to change from time to time, and we actually, for the first time, have a drawn-up plan of what we want to get to, it seems very appealing. But with you, Katie, I think a lot of people just may not want to sign away rights, period, regardless of the situation.
I know we're kind of,
I'll say up at Polly's Island, there were 3 homeowners, and it was, I believe they're along the south end of the island that was critically eroded before they did the project in 2020. And they did their local project, but I think they've gone through 2 rounds of condemnation to try to get those 3 easements, and the town has failed in both of those. I think they're working on 4 or 5 years worth of that process by now. So you're right, it only takes one, holdout. So I'd encourage you also to maybe talk to those folks at the Polly's and possibly talk to the homeowners. I think they've been very communicative with the town, trying to reach it. They're very well informed. They've read all the documents and all of that.
So Stephen, the town tried to condemn those properties twice and failed?
Yes.
just
That would be
the
the
easement,
all-
probably just the easement.
I don't know all the details, and yes, it was just the easement area. It wasn't the entire property. I believe the first time was, I'll call it loosely, kind of a clerical or process issue that threw it out. I'm not sure what happened with the second.
Was it condemned or was it eminent domain?
I'm not sure which legal process they used for it.
I will also say, my takeaway from, we're getting to Army Corps stuff, which is not on the agenda, but I will say, talking to Folly Beach, it seemed like if it is a Army Corps project, it's gonna get very bad before they show up.
Yeah.
And I kind of kept hearing this group talking about being proactive, doing these projects in a situation, in a world that kept it from ever getting bad. And then hearing the Folly folks say, they're not going to show up until until it's way up under houses, in houses. That's kind of when it triggers them to show up. So made me wonder if there is, if it would fit. It would fit with kind of our community expectation of it just not getting ever that bad.
I also heard, though, that it doesn't preclude us from doing what we want to do. It's sort of a belt suspenders or an insurance policy, and if it could work and help us out and alleviate some of the cost pressures, I think we've got to have to make the economic and the implementation decision at some point. If we can get the easements, it's $3 million worth putting a project plan in place for the next 50 years to help alleviate some of this funding that we have to do. And I don't know the answer to that. That's a complicated one.
Yeah, I think that if we do a project in between them, then we're never
They're
gonna
not
get
gonna-
They're never
it.
gonna show up.
Exactly, right.
They're never gonna get to
It'll
a
be
point
helpful.
where they would come in. So I don't know what value
Yeah.
they would bring to the city if we're doing
Well,
it.
if they had it would be in the event that we had a catastrophic event and we needed help down the road and we didn't have the money for it.
Correct.
But the only thing I took out of that was, she said more than once, they're slow and expensive.
And I think catastrophic event, I think, once we've done it, they funded a large part of the Wild Dunes project because we had done a project and it was a loss to our project as part of a catastrophic event, so they funded it. So I'm not convinced that it's even a reasonable insurance policy. If
Yeah.
it's our expectation to be proactive, always have a healthy beach. May not be fully aligned.
Back to, you're on your own.
Yeah. Okay, great.
All right, so we're next week with Edisto. Douglas, I really think that'll take the hour.
Okay.
If Folly's any example. We can be prepared to head down the path on emergency. Yeah.
stuff, and we're still waiting for Polly's, so we'll fit,
Yeah.
if we get Polly's, you want to do them 3 weeks out? Or do you
Yeah,
want to do
'cause
them on the heels?
25th. No?
I can't make the 25th, but y'all can keep rocking. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll just see what their
Yeah, see what their schedule is.
availability is like.
Availability.